with that comes a real risk that actually some of these policies and decisions are based around short-term political planning rather than sound long-term financial governance. And I very much hope that's not a situation that we move to in terms of how our economy is managed here in the UK. It is, of course, my job to introduce our two speakers this morning, albeit they don't need any introduction. We have the lovely Amanda Gunter, who's Head of Tax here at AC Knoll, and also Tom Chiffers, the private client team partner at Clarke Willmott. And I'm sure you'll all join me in extending your thanks to both of them for their late nights and early mornings that they spent over the last couple of days to be able to do their presentations here today. There will be the opportunity for a Q&A session at the end. For those who join us online, if you log in using your Google account, you'll be able to submit questions, and obviously we'll take questions from the room as well. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Amanda.
Morning, everyone. On what is actually hopefully going to be quite a nice morning. Now, one thing I was thinking the other day when I was sat down listening to the autumn statement is that what's the difference between an autumn statement and over the last few years, not a lot. They have all blurred together. Now, the autumn statement is supposed to be the opportunity for the government to present the state of the economy to us. It's not supposed to be about making tax changes. So in some ways, I wasn't surprised that we didn't see too much happening. But what we have seen, particularly last year, where we were presenting here twice in 5 weeks, there is constant change. So we're seeing quite a lot of tinkering around the edges on a regular basis. So this autumn statement didn't really surprise us when we had the presentation of the economy and then a few tax changes. Now, as always, the Chancellor starts with positive news. Now, this has obviously been, I'm going to say, leaked or announced prior to him standing up on Wednesday. And the big point was that inflation was less than half what it was in November 22. So we saw peak inflation at 11.1%. Now that has dropped quite significantly, and last month it stood at 4.6%. But what you might notice from there is actually if he'd have stood up a month before, he would not have been able to say that the government had reached their goal of halving inflation. Now, what I thought it would be interesting to see is what were the Office for Budget Responsibilities predicting in relation to inflation. Now, as of March, we stood up here and the prediction for the fall in inflation was a little bit faster and steeper, which is what you can see by that orange line. I remember standing here saying that's quite a feat if we were to achieve that line. Now, where we get towards the end, you'll see that actually our 4.6% isn't too far different from what the OBR were predicting. But what they have said is that inflation was persistent, which meant that it didn't come down as fast as they were expecting. Now, if you carry this forward to a long-term forecast, the OBR are saying that inflation will reach 2.8% at the end of 2024, and it will reach the government's target inflation rate of 2% at the end of 2025. So what is bringing down inflation? Now, if you read some of the statement notes, then one of the key things is in relation to energy prices. So we've seen drops in energy. We may have also noticed that when we go and do our weekly shop, prices are actually stabilising. So we're seeing those prices stabilising, which is helping inflation. Areas at the moment that aren't helping a reduction in inflation are actually in the service industry, which is coming down to wage costs. Now, with an increase in the living wage from next April, that's not going to help inflation. The other thing that's not going to help inflation is an increase in our energy prices, which we're expecting at the beginning of next year. So what else is helping to bring down inflation? So the Bank of England, one of their targets or one of their roles is to help control inflation. So what have they done to help it to actually control our inflation? We've all felt it. They've put up the base rate. Now, I had a look and I thought it'd be interesting to see how that increase has gone. So back in November 2021, Bank of England base rate, 0.1%. We have seen significant change on a regular basis. So current base rate, 5.25%. Now, I was looking at all these points the other day, and I was going to use the words, it's stabilised at 5.25%. And the reason I was using that word is because actually for the last 3 months, it's been the same. You wouldn't think that 3 months was stable. However, if you look back through, that is the longest period of non-change in the Bank of England base rate since November 2021. Now, you might see there's a little bit of a correlation there between the increase in the base rate and the drop in inflation. It will be interesting to see what does happen over the next 3-6 months. Will we still be able to say that Bank of England base rate has stabilised? Now, I'm not going to make that prediction because I've got to admit, where I've thought about it each time I've stood up here, I haven't got it right. So I'm not going to make any predictions. So the next positive point that we got from the Chancellor was in relation to growth. Now, if anyone did sit there and listen to the presentation, you'll have noticed when he was talking about growth, he covered current year growth and then very quickly went through future growth forecasts. Now, what you can see from here is the reason he focused on the current year is because it is more positive than the OBR were originally predicting in March. So back in March, they were saying that although we weren't going to have a technical recession, and by technical recession, that means that here in the UK, we have to have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Now, we weren't going to have that technical recession, but we were going to have overall negative growth for 2023. The current forecast, and we're quite a long way through the year, so they should be getting this reasonably right, is that for this year, we'll see positive growth of 0.5%. So that was the positive that we heard about in the speech. What he went through very quickly thereafter is that the OBR are actually reining back in their growth forecasts, which you can see from this chart. So the blue columns are what they were originally predicting back in March, and then the orange columns are what they're now predicting. So you can see quite visually how much they have reined things back in for 24, 25, and then we're getting closer to what they think it was going to be for 26. Now, this doesn't bode well for the economy, and it's why he didn't go into very much detail about it in his speech. Okay, now you all know that I like to do a bit about debt and borrowing, because this is something that I always like to run through. First positive that he said about was our public sector net debt. So our public sector net debt for the current year, 97.9%. Now, if you've got 97.9% of a mortgage against the property of your house, property value, you might be thinking, oh, that's quite tight. It's what you would call high gearing. However, this was a positive because it was lower than they thought it was going to be, because they were predicting it at about 100%. All right. Now, if you look at the forecast going forward, in every year of the forecast, our public sector net debt as a percentage of our GDP, so that's gross domestic product, does reduce. And you can see that positive trend in 28-29, it goes down to 92.8%. Now, the one thing that did surprise me during his speech, and I did double check it afterwards when I read through, is actually that our percentage debt to GDP is the second lowest in the G7. Now, that's second to Germany, and then Canada comes in third. All right, that actually quite surprised me. And I did a little bit of reading to see that all those that were behind us have all got policies now coming into play to help them reduce their debt to GDP. But on a long-term forecast, we continue to be second or third within that G7 group. So he went on to say about our borrowing requirement. Now you'll see that we still have a borrowing requirement. Now what that means is that we spend more than we bring in. Now in our own households, if we spend more than we bring in on a regular basis, we might get a little bit upset about it. But for the entire forecast, we are predicted to continue to need to borrow. So our current borrowings in terms at the moment, 5% of GDP, which in absolute terms, 124 billion for the current year. That is going down year on year, and at the end of the forecast, it's looking to reduce to 1.1% of GDP, which in absolute terms would be 35 billion. Now I say billion, it just sounds like one of those words, doesn't it? You know, pound to me, a billion to them. But then we look at our total gross debt. So if we're requiring borrowing every year, we're adding to our total gross debt. And it currently stands at £2.7 trillion. It's not a number that I can put on my calculator. That's what it stands at the moment. So if you roll that forward to 28-29, it's an even bigger figure. All right. Now, you and I all know, if you've got debt, what do you pay on your debt? Interest. Now, I've looked at this year after year because I find it quite shocking that our debt interest is more than what we spend on education. It will continue to be more than what we spend on education for every year of the forecast. So, that's a quick run through of the economy. What exactly did he do? Now, most people were seeing on the BBC website the major things that he actually did during the year. National insurance. So if you are self-employed, you pay Class 2 national insurance. It's at a rate of £3.45 per week, and as he announced, it's going to be abolished. Okay? For most people that are self-employed, you pay Class 2 through your self-assessment, so you may not even realise you're paying Class 2. It's only on where you're making profits above £12,570. If your profits are between £6,725 and the £12,570, then you don't have to pay Class 2, but you do get a credit for it. Anyone with profits below £6,725 can make voluntary contributions. Now, the reason you might want to make voluntary contributions is because that does go towards your contributory benefits. Now, most of us will know that our Class 2 goes towards our state pension entitlement. So if they're going to abolish it, how on earth are you still going to get your state pension benefits? Well, for anyone who's got profits above £6,725, you will get a credit towards those contributory benefits. The little quirk that he didn't mention anything about is if you've got profits below £6,725, then you can still continue to make voluntary contributions. Why would you choose to do that? Because if you don't, then you're not actually getting the credit towards those contributory benefits. So for some, they might continue to make Class 2 contributions. We went on with national insurance. So straight after announcing the Class 2, he went on to say about Class 4. So at the moment, the main rate for Class 4 is 9%. No, my slides have slipped and they've moved over, because actually that's going to be 8% from the 6th of April 2024. We've had a few IT glitches this morning, and this is one of them. So he's cutting the rate from 9% to 8%. Now, we paid the main rate of Class 4 National Insurance on self-employed profits between £12,570 and £50,270. Above that higher rate, we're still paying 2%, and that hasn't changed. The other thing that hasn't changed is the thresholds. That's why. Thank you to our IT manager for telling me what to do. So he hasn't changed those thresholds for numerous years. And I think we might be mentioning that a bit later on as well. So my colleague and I, Rebecca, we were sat in the conference room when we were listening to this. And as soon as he mentioned Class 4, we looked at each other and said, well, he can't just do that for the self-employed. He's going to have to do something for employees. He did. So our Class 1 National Insurance is dropping from 12% to 10%. Now, the one thing that is slightly different between these is the dates they apply from. So for some strange reason, he's gone and put it in that the Class 1 is going to change from the 6th of January. In his speech, he said it was because he wanted people to benefit straight away. My thought was that he just wanted to make software providers a little bit busier, because this is going to be a software update requirement for anyone who's actually using payrolls for this to be implemented. Once again, the main rate for Class 1 is applied to the same limits as it is for Class 4, and anything above those limits, the rate's still at 2%. The next thing he started trumpeting was about full expensing. Now, you may remember back in March, if you were here, he introduced something known as full expensing. It was going to be for 3 years from the 1st of April this year. So there was a time frame on it. He said at the time that they would want to make it permanent as and when the economy would be able to cope with it. It is now permanent. Full expensing is a relief, it's a capital allowance relief for companies. It's going to apply that you get 100% relief for what we call qualifying plant and machinery in your general pool. To give you an idea, qualifying plant and machinery in this room, tables, chairs, they're all qualifying. There's also a 50% relief for investment in what we call special rate assets. Now, I look around this room and I get all excited thinking, oh, that's the lighting and the heating. So anything that you spend new on what I would call integral features, you can claim 50%. But one thing to remember is that that relief for full expensing is only for companies. We still have the annual investment allowance. Now, the annual investment allowance is £1 million, and it applies to all businesses, so to the self-employed and partnerships, and that is still there, so we won't forget that one. So what didn't he say? Well, it was quite a lot, actually, that he didn't say, and a lot of it is going through all of the things that we've seen over the last probably 4 years. The biggest things. So this year, corporation tax increased to 25%. So we are now into this new regime for corporation tax. Before, our corporation tax rate was 19%. Now we've got a main rate of 25%. We have got a small company rate. So if profits are under 50,000, it's 19%. For profits between 50,000 and 250,000, it's a marginal rate, 25% thereafter. Now, who's heard the word fiscal drag in the last few days? It's been mentioned quite a lot. Fiscal drag, in very simplistic terms, is where you drag someone into paying higher rates of tax. Now, this is because something happened a number of years ago, which I was talking to Tom about earlier, and I think it was the most genius method of tax raising that I've seen. So we've got our allowances and thresholds frozen. They've been frozen for a number of years and will be for a number of other years. Now, it's a bit of a stealth tax when you think about it, because you don't really notice, but with wage increase, profit growth, more people's profits are going above these thresholds, and so you're paying more tax because they've been frozen. Now, one thing that we did see actually that came in before is our additional rate threshold that has dropped. So again, you've got more people falling into higher and additional rates. The other things we saw that we've announced, dividend allowance. Dividend allowance used to be £2,000. From the 6th of April this year, it's dropped to £1,000. And let's not forget that next year, it's dropping to £500. Now, those sound like small amounts, but actually it's meaning that more people are going to be paying a little bit more tax, and for some, it actually brings them into self-assessment as well. Tax rates. Now, it's always interesting when I ask people, how many tax rates do you think we have? Because you sort of think, oh, we haven't got many. Well, on that slide, we've got 6. Quite confusing, and that's just in relation to income tax. Now, they are the same, all right? So we've got 20%, 40%, 45% for non-dividend income, and then we've got some strange rates for dividend income at 8.75, 33.75, 39.35. The other thing that was announced last March was in relation to pensions. So we've got some slight increases in allowances. So the annual allowance is now 60,000, whereas it was 40,000. And our tapered allowances went from 240,000 to 260,000. And we had an abolition of the lifetime allowance. So what else should we look out for? All of us know that we've got a general election coming up. Life has been turbulent, I think is probably a good word for something that's happened over the last 3 years. So is there anything that we really should be looking out for? I sat and thought about this, and this is all I could come up with. I think it will continue to be turbulent. One thing that we have always seen when we have either a change in government or even a renewal of government, the time for change, significant tax policy change, is within the first 12 to 18 months. So I think we will be back here again soon after there's an election with a reasonable amount of change. And on that note, I'm actually going to pass you over to Tom.
Is it already switched on?
Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Lexi. Let's just make sure it all works. Yes, hello, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you everyone who's watching at home or watching in the future if you're watching the recording. Hope everyone enjoyed their breakfast. It's always a treat. So yes, rather interesting. Let's talk a bit about context. Lexi gave us a great discussion on context first, but let's talk a bit about the background. So for me, I think it's so important what happened last year when you're either fortunate or unfortunate enough to see us twice in less than 6 weeks, and also to think what's going to happen next year, because we've got an election. So the government are in a sort of an impossible position, because on one hand they've got to try and get everyone to forget what happened last year when everything was a little bit crazy, and also to try and catch up on the Labour Party, who are so far ahead in the polls. So they can't be both solid and boring and good custodians of the economy, and also they can't really do anything new to try and get voters back. So what do? So, but we had some good news. Inflation went down, and you saw Amanda's graph just now, went down to 4.6%. So back, not where the target is, but at least closer. And it's important to remember that in the run-up to the weeks before the budget, Jeremy Hunt came out and said, don't bother looking for tax cuts, there won't be any because we can't afford it. Now that changed. That changed after that figure got released, after the inflation figure was more positive perhaps than they might have thought it would be. It's important to remember where it was a year ago when it was 11.1% back in October of last year. So they're back, remembering that graph that Amanda showed us, they're going in the right direction. House prices also were slightly more positive than many would have expected. They actually went up for the first time in 6 months, but they're still predicted to go down. So again, people are slightly more positive, but still not, not really great news that they might have been wishing for. So were there going to be tax cuts? There were lots of things that came up in the week or two before. They were talking about maybe cutting income tax, maybe cutting inheritance tax. Even that really caught my attention because I was thinking, am I going to have a job in a couple of weeks' time if they get rid of inheritance tax? I needn't have been worried because there wasn't anything that exciting, as you would have known. Starting with some of the things that they did do, business rates. Now, as everyone who runs a business knows, this is a really important expense, really thing that takes it out. For those who don't, it's basically council tax for businesses. Now, what they tried to do is continue the relief that they announced before. So the rate relief has been extended for further 12 months. Now, what was that relief? Well, it applies, so Lexi and Amanda both talked about the challenges that the retail sector are facing and the hospitality sector are facing. Now, this is the discount that's aimed specifically at that. So it's a 75% discount specifically for the retail and hospitality and leisure industry. Jeremy Hunt was very clear, this is not a permanent cut, this is just extending a short-term cut for another year to try and ease the difficulties, potentially with thinking of energy rises next year, but it's only going to be for another year. At the same time, they also froze the small business multiplier for 24-25. For those who don't know, the way that the business rates work is based on the value of your property, and then if you're either a large business or a small business, based on the threshold, you multiply that value by a certain figure. And usually that figure goes up each year to go in line with inflation. What they've done is they've frozen that figure, but just for small businesses for the next tax year. So whereas it's currently 49.9p against the value of the property, if your business is, or the value of the property is less than 51,000, then that will be frozen for next year as well. But if you're not a small business, then it's going to go up by 6.4%, broadly in line with inflation, to now be 54.5p. So if you're a small business, and if you're a small retail business, you've got essentially two lots of benefits that have been announced at the same time. So that could be welcomed by a lot of the retail and leisure industry who, as we talked about, are under a lot of pressure at the moment with online retailers, lack of staff, and the economy being more sluggish than they would like. Now, benefits. So we obviously know that we're in the cost of living crisis. That's the way we're calling it. Inflation is a big issue. Benefits, of course, are a real crunch point in that. They're a real indicator of where the government is able to make provision for people under benefits when they're under pressure with cost of living crisis, with energy prices, all those things that are going up. We know that wages are going up, but can benefits also go up at the same time to ease that pressure? As we talked about, the government are also under pressure. They're under pressure in the polls, and traditionally it's assumed that pensioners, older people, are the sort of core Conservative vote. So maybe with one mind on that, they've talked about addressing benefits at the same time, starting with the state pension. I'm sure everyone knows, they've heard the phrase, the triple lock. That basically means they've got three options. They're locked into saying we will put pension up by one of three things. Now, they can, if they choose to be a bit canny, and put it up by the sort of the lesser of those three three indicators, but actually they didn't do that. They put it up by 8.5%, and that is in line with wage growth. As I say, wages are going up. So they did pick it. So that means, remembering Amanda's slide from a few moments ago, that is above, in line with inflation. So they're basically inflation buster, putting pension up. They're keeping the triple lock. And again, one of the many rumours that went round before the budget was announced is that they might bin the triple lock off, because this is a bit of an albatross around the Chancellor's neck. But they haven't done that. They've kept the triple lock promise, and it's gone up by 8.5%. On the left hand of the slide, you can see they've also put up what they call working age benefits. So basically, benefits for people who have working age. And those include lots of things, but the most common is universal credit or personal independence payment or ESA. Now, those are all going up by 6.7% from April next year. Now, again, they had a choice. So as we talked about right at the beginning, inflation is going down. Now, traditionally, what they do with these benefits is they look at the inflationary figure and they increase the benefits by that figure. What they've chosen to do is not take the inflation figure from October, which they could have done. They've taken the inflation figure from September, which is actually higher, obviously, as we said, because inflation is going down. So again, they've done a little bit more than they needed to. Now, is that with one eye on the election next year? Is that with one eye on the polls? I think so. Front page of the Times today said that these two benefit increases has meant that the Conservatives have gained 4 points in the polls. Now, I think in reality it's too early to say. That was only 2 days ago. But they're obviously thinking this might be something that's going to attract voters back to us, or at least try and get us higher in the polls. They did make other changes to the benefits. Now, this is probably one of the topics that actually the Chancellor spoke most about. I think it's because what they're trying to do is create the impression that they're getting people out, getting people working. Now, we all know that working practices have changed a lot since COVID. You know, the first few of these we did over the computer, we did remotely. But a lot of people who are working now split their time between home or the office, or they spend all their time at home. Now, what Jeremy Hunt talked about is reflecting that change in the way that benefits and the way that the programme to help people back to work is changed. So what did they do? Well, they focused on the sanctions, I suppose, which seems like a harsh word, but it's really actually about the way that benefits are both calculated and the programme for getting people back to work is arranged. So let's look at the detail. So there's something called a restart scheme. Now, previously that started if someone had been on universal credit for 9 months. That's been cut to 6. So basically you've got less time before you move into a more energetic and involved programme to try and get you back to work. The restart scheme basically involves more attention from job centres and other professionals involved, and making sure you go to job fairs and you go to more interviews and you have help with your CV and those sort of things. So trying to energise the process of getting people back to work. They will also be a bit more rigorous in terms of tracking what people do. So they're tracking people's attendance at those interviews and at those job fairs, giving them a bit more scrutiny. And there will be what's called a mandatory work placement after a year. Now, that basically means you're going to have to go and essentially work for free if you haven't found a job after a year. Now, again, that's the aim of that, is to try and get people back to work and back into the working environment. But that's a big change, because you obviously need to find the administration to sort that out and to place people and to make sure that they are able to get there and they're able to do the job and they're able to help the people that they're working with. The final sanction is something called if a person has been placed in what they call open-ended sanction, which what that means is that they haven't done the things that they are supposed to do. So if you're on universal credit, you have a set of rules that you have to correspond with in terms of meetings you attend or interviews you attend or job fairs you attend. If you have not done that, if you've not done what you've agreed to do, and you're in what they call open-ended sanction, then basically your benefits will stop after 6 months. And that doesn't just mean the payment you get, that doesn't just mean universal credit, that also means things like your free prescriptions and all those other things. So really that final change in the sanctions could be very, very significant for some people, and is really a change of focus. It's making it much more hard-lined in terms of those people who are claiming universal credit. The assessment have also changed. The way that people are assessed who are on universal credit has changed. Now, what Jeremy Hunt talked about is trying to get more people who could work back to work. So he talked about a number of people who are inactive, who aren't working. He gave the figure of 100,000 people who are either on sickness or disability benefits, who have no rules about what they have to do in order to claim universal credit. In other words, they're on benefits and there's no sort of programme to get you back to work. Now, the Office of Budget Responsibility estimates that there are 2.6 million people who are what they call inactive. In other words, they're not working. They're either on benefits or they're not claiming any benefits at all. And that's gone up by a fifth. So it's gone up by 500,000 people since the pandemic. So that's people who were working before who aren't working now. So whether they fall under benefits or not, they're not in the working market. They're not in the job market. So what these changes were to do, that Jeremy Hunt said, was to try and reduce that number. So get those people back to work who previously were working and now are claiming benefits. So there's a concept called the Work Capability Assessment. Now that's to do with a person's fitness to work. Can they work? If they can work, what can they do? As I talked about a few moments ago, obviously working practices have changed. More people are working from home. So therefore, do those capacity assessments, their capability assessments need to change. They're important for getting people back to work, but they're probably more important for assessing that rule, the agreement that a person who claims benefits has with the government about being able to claim their universal credit. And that's assessed on what they're capable of doing. So can they move? Can they lift things? Can they walk unaided? Can they travel? All of those sorts of things. There's lots of characteristics, but it's the mobility one that the government is really focused on with these announcements. So they're talking about changing, they're talking about changing the way that those assessments are done. They are aiming to spend 1.3 billion. Now, it might seem a small amount when you remember Amanda's slides from a few moments ago when we were talking about trillions, but they're aiming to help 700,000 people. So we talked about there's 2.6 million people inactive, not working. They're aiming at helping 700,000 people. And the way they're going to do that is basically to change the way that assessment is done. So they're removing that mobility element of that assessment. So basically, if you're currently on universal credit and you're claiming universal credit on the basis that your mobility is the issue, so you remember, you're not claiming disability living allowance or anything like that, you're claiming universal credit, then basically what the government are proposing is that they will remove that category. So you will not be able to claim universal credit based on mobility alone. So the rationale being, well, if you can't move about, if you can't get out, then you can just get a job from home. Now, lots of disability charities and other services were very upset by the proposal. They're talking about it being discrimination against disabled people. I think the reality is that we won't know until we see a bit more detail about what they're proposing to do. But as I say, I think this could have a real impact on people who do claim universal credit and who fall within that mobility category. Now, let's talk a bit about taxes, capital taxes, my sort of bread and butter, capital gains tax. Now, was there any exciting announcements? No, there weren't anything. But what it means is that the changes announced last year are carrying on. So for those of you who don't remember, the annual allowance, which is, by way of reminder, the allowance that you have each year for capital gains, and you only pay capital gains tax on gains above that allowance, that was cut last year. In fact, it was more than halved. It was 12,300, it was cut to 6,000. The fact that there was an absence of any announcement means that the second cut that was announced last year will come in from April of next year. It will be halved again. It is currently 6,000, was 12,300 the year before, and it will now be cut to £3,000 for individuals. So if you think in a 2-year period, it's gone from 12,300 to £3,000. So less than a quarter of what it was. For trusts, it's half the personal allowance. So it's £3,000 now, it'll be £1,500. So what that basically means is that there really is no meaningful annual allowance anymore. Stuart, who I can see over there, when I came back to CW, he said, if you cut the annual allowance, people just won't do it. They won't sell things. They won't make transactions. Well, I think that's probably true. But what it does mean is that it's basically all gains you have now, if you have a gain, if you don't have any choice about doing it, it's going to be taxable. So it's a virtual wipeout of the annual allowance. Now, it's important to remember, when we talk about capital gains tax, to think about the rates. Now, the rates are quite unusual insofar as that historically, and by historically I mean, more than 10 or 15 years ago, when I first started working, that the capital gains tax rate matched income tax. The rationale being that you couldn't be clever or pay someone clever like me and Amanda to get people taxed under capital gains rather than income tax. If you had them the same, then it was equitable, it was fair. But that hasn't been the case for the last 10 or 15 years. The rate now is split between the basic rate and the higher rate, and that's different for residential property and everything else. So 18 or 28% for residential property, or 10 or 20 for all other gains. So that is unusual in the context of the history of capital gains. Traditionally, it was much higher than that. So there was a lot of talk last year about would they put the rates back up? Would they put it back up in line with income tax rates? Now, again, echoing what Amanda said a little while ago, they didn't do that. They were sort of slightly cuter than that, I should say, and what they did was cut the annual allowance, and they will cut it again in April of next year. What does that mean for the receipts? Now, it actually means that capital gains tax receipts have almost doubled in 4 years. And going back to what Amanda said about the budget post-pandemic, when everyone was saying, what are they going to do? Are they going to make tax rises? Actually, by cutting the allowance in this case, or not changing the rates, they've actually doubled the receipts that they make. So how much do they make from capital gains tax? Well, they're predicting for this tax year to make 17.1 billion. Now, seems like a lot, but it's actually not even 2% of the total tax receipts that the government makes. So it's a small tax, but it's significant. As they say, they've doubled the receipts in 4 years, and that's going to carry on. It's gone up by nearly 2 billion for the year up to October of last year. So again, by cutting the allowance, it seems like a small change, but actually it's made a big difference, because if we go back to what Amanda said about fiscal drag or fiscal creep, they've accelerated that, because not only have they fixed the allowance, they've gone one further by cutting it. So all the inflationary pressures, the rises of things have meant that more is taxable, and they're going to increase their revenue from the tax. So one final thing, business asset disposal relief, that hasn't changed. That was cut from 10 million down to 1. That's still the same. So if you're disposing of your business or part of a business, that won't change. So inheritance tax, again, were there any exciting announcements? There was lots of talk, and they're going to cut inheritance tax. They're going to get rid of it. Am I going to lose my job? No, is the answer. They didn't do any of those things. So Amanda talked about the thresholds being fixed. Actually, last year they announced that the thresholds will be fixed from 2028. So again, that hasn't changed. Those thresholds stay the same. That means that pretty much for my whole career, certainly when I was a trainee, the nil rate band has not changed. So it hasn't changed. It used to go up every year. It hasn't now changed since 6th of April 2009. So that'll be nearly 19 years by the time we get there next year. If you remember the figure for capital gains tax, 17 billion, only 7.2 billion for inheritance tax. So a lot less. It's a much smaller tax. So it's anywhere between sort of 3 and 5% of the population actually pay inheritance tax. It's hugely unpopular, but it's actually a relatively small tax in terms of the proportion of people who pay it and the amount of revenue that the HM revenue generate. But it has gone up. So as we talked about with capital gains tax, that jumped up. Inheritance tax has gone up too. So it's up from 5.1 billion in 1920, and it's now up to 7.2 billion. quick reminder of the rates, 40% if you've died, 20% during your lifetime. If you give 10% to charity, it's down to 36%. Quick reminder for the thresholds, 325,000, and then it can be up to £1 million for couples. So there's the graphs. That's a reminder of where the rates have gone up. So if you look back in 2000 down to 2 billion, it's going to be best part of 9 billion by 2028. This is from the Office of Budget Responsibility. So you see how it's going in that upward trajectory. Again, fiscal creep, fiscal drag, those are the phrases that are relevant here. They've kept the thresholds fixed and the revenue's gone up. So one of the things that a lot of people ask is what's going to change? What's going to happen? Are the reliefs under threat? Is inheritance tax going to be got rid of? Well, it's definitely in focus. People are focusing on it. People are talking about it. There was two main reports, the all-party parliamentary group and then the Office of Tax Simplification. Both had reports a couple of years ago that talked about getting rid of inheritance tax reliefs. So that's a relief where you don't have to pay inheritance tax, or changing the rate. Neither of those were followed. The Office of Tax Simplification was got rid of, and the all-party parliamentary group report was shelved, was moved aside. So it's on the horizon, but there's nothing concrete. Will that change with the new government? I don't know, is the answer, but I think it's likely that there will be some changes. One of the things that has been sort of drip feeding the information is that the Labour Party are talking about they might get rid of agricultural property relief or business property relief or both. That will have a significant impact, not just on farmers and business owners, but investors as well. Octopus, which isn't the only one, but one of the biggest investors that hold investments that are exempt from inheritance tax due to business property relief, they have 13 billion under management. I wouldn't like to talk on their behalf, but I imagine a fair proportion of that wouldn't be there unless business property relief existed. So if they got rid of business property relief, that's 13 billion worth of investments, which would not be worth 13 billion by the end of the day. Again, not much of substance from the Conservatives either, but they've talked about potentially abolishing inheritance tax. Would they do it? Would they make the changes? We just don't know. Agricultural property relief is something that I advise on a lot. It's really important relief for farmers. The challenge we've got at the moment is that there is, following Brexit, a change in the way that subsidies are paid. There's a new concept, something called ELMS, and there are other subsidies as well, which are really focused on farmers setting land aside, letting it go wild, encouraging nature to be part of it, rather than focusing on, growing food, growing animals, having those sort of things, actually farming. But the trouble is that agricultural property relief hasn't caught up with those changes. And the NFU, before the budget, made really clear that they wanted some clarity. Their members, farmers, wanted some clarity about whether these reliefs were going to be updated to reflect the change of subsidies. There was absolutely nothing about it in the budget. It was really disappointing because farmers want some clarity about what there's going to be. There's indication, there's hints that they're going to update it, but again, another opportunity was missed, and they didn't follow up, and they didn't update it. Now I'm conscious of time, it's now 10 o'clock. I was going to run through a very exciting case about business property relief, but I wonder whether should we finish at 10, or have we got time? Okay, that's fine. We talked about business property relief. Now, you'll forgive me for indulging me talking about these sort of reliefs. I find these things really interesting. Don't tell me whether you do or not. Don't upset me. But business property relief, as we talked about, really important relief for business owners, but it's only available for trading businesses, not businesses that have investments. Now, the business has to be wholly and mainly trading, i.e. not holding investments. Now, this is interesting because there are businesses that do a bit of both. There are businesses that have some investment elements. In other words, they hold assets and they get the income from them, and then they might be engaged in a trade. There was an interesting case recently. I should just say that this is assessed on 5 tests, 5 separate tests The revenue look at the business and they look at those tests, time spent, capital employed, income, profit, and then the overall context. What does it look like? Does it look like a trading business or does it look like an investment business? In other words, the elephant test. Now, the case that came up was one involved it was actually a trust. It wasn't a person's estate who died. It was a trust. They had a 10-year anniversary charge. Inheritance tax is charged on trusts every 10 years. It wasn't doing the trading itself, but it held shares in a business that did. Now, this business owned an enterprise or ran an enterprise that was sort of part apartments, part hotel. They called itself an apart hotel. Now, I found that those sort of words a bit distasteful, but there we go. It's a hybrid. It's basically a bit of a hotel, a bit of an apartment. Now, where does that sit? Apartments, if you're letting apartments out, that is clearly an investment. But if you're running a hotel, then that's a trading business. Now, this case was interesting because it looked at where that line was. Where is the line between those two things? And is there, most importantly, a clear line? The reason that's important is because it gives clarity to taxpayers to know where does their business sit. Are they going to be eligible for business property relief or are they not? This business was very much a mix of investment and trading, and it really came down to the evidence of the people running that business, and more importantly, how that evidence was interpreted by the revenue and how that evidence came across. So, the things that were relevant were the way that the guests were looked after, the way the guests were treated. What were the extra services that they were given? Did they just turn up and be given a key to a room and they stayed there, or were they given more of a hotel experience? Now, this company had lots of sites. They had sites all over the place. They sort of found buildings, found blocks of flats, and they'd sort of taken them over and they'd converted them into their purposes. So it's really difficult to get a clear idea because it wasn't a single site, it wasn't a single premises. They were all a bit different. So one, for example, had a cafe downstairs. 3 had receptions. And others had a communal space, some didn't, some did. So it was difficult to get a clear idea. Now, what everyone got when they arrived was a welcome pack. Basically said, welcome to the apart hotel, etc., etc. But crucially, they had to pay for the extra services. They weren't included. So they had the option of doing that. So the cafe, they had the option of going down for breakfast. But when the revenue sort of put a bit of scrutiny to it, that cafe was only there because that was a planning condition for them converting that building. It wasn't there really to provide for the guests. It was because they had to have a cafe there to provide services under the planning rules. And although the patrons of the apart hotel could go down, they would be treated just like anyone else who walked in off the street. They didn't have any extra. It wasn't included in their price. So it doesn't sound much like a hotel. Now, the really crucial bit of the evidence was the turnover, the money involved. It wasn't just the services that were provided. Now, it turned out that actually the extras were a very peripheral part of the overall business, less than 5% of the turnover. And also those receptions, I said there were 3 receptions, well, they're actually closed 2/3 of the time. And although they were called receptions, in reality, they were their administrative hubs for the employees to basically process the rental or the payments for the hotels. They weren't really there in a traditional sense of a reception for a hotel to provide and help guests. So it was found that overall, this was more of an investment business than a trading business. And crucially, what the tribunal found was that they said there isn't a clear line. So if you're looking for a clear line between what's investment and trading, don't look here, because it's basically going to be judged on the facts, which is not very helpful to us. But there you go. So that concludes my side of things. I will hand over to Lexi, and she can field any questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and I'm sure you'll all join me in extending our thanks to Tom and Amanda. Really insightful presentations. Are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? Straight away, no, there. That was
Hi. Amanda, probably for you, and I'm going to be cheeky or greedy, and ask 2 if I may. Firstly, why do you have a view or as to why the Chancellor froze the tax thresholds till 2028? That seems a long way away, but not. The second question, we're at a racecourse. You said we needed to think about everything and anything the Chancellor might do. Do you have any tips or predictions as to one or two things you think he might do in the next budget?
Do you want to repeat the questions as well? So the questions were, why were the thresholds frozen until 28, and what were your views on what he might do in the next budget, just for the benefit of those joining at home?
Why did he freeze them till 2028? Because he could predict how much more revenue he was going to get over that period of time. So when I look back, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, goodness, what's he doing? It's genius. Because he forecasted forward for a long period of time to see how he could raise revenue without people noticing. Normally, where you see things happen, if you're going to have a rate increase or a rate decrease, anything like that, it's obvious. Freezing thresholds and allowances is sneaky because you just do not notice. And he did it for a long period of time so that he could double his benefit in many ways. If you did it only for a couple of years, it wasn't going to give you enough. If you forecasted forward for long enough, actually your revenue raising is quite significant. I can remember looking at it at the time, and when I looked at it, I thought, wow, it really does make a difference. So I would say, now I wasn't in the room, so I don't know, but I would say they looked at it as to where they needed to stop. Now originally, I think they were probably looking around 2026, but they've gone for 2028 because it gives them quite a significant change. And if you looked at the way the graphs went, it really was significant. My tips? Now I always get this wrong. What do I think will happen next year? Change of government? I think it could be horrific. IHT, it's ripe for change. If Labour get in next year, yeah, I think we will see changes on IHT. Do I think they will withdraw reliefs? BPR, possibly not. APR, I think, is ripe. All right, just the way it goes. Capital gains tax, that's always been ripe. I've said that for the last 10 years, so I could still be wrong with that. Why is it not at the same level as income tax? It's an easy one. It's a really easy one. All you've got to do is from tomorrow, we're putting the rate up to the same as income tax. Very, very simple. It doesn't raise enough, though, I will say, because it's such a low tax. So the reason these things might not happen is because they aren't raising enough. So will they do something more drastic than that? I don't know if they will. Anyone who's sensible probably won't, because actually you don't want to go and upset the entire population after they might have just voted you in. If we're going to see anything, it's always within the first 12 to 18 months after we see either a change in government or a renewal of government. Date for election next year, we were debating it on our table. When's it going to be? May? August? A bit later? At the moment, my feeling is that actually they're going to hold off with the election and they're going to see if they can get those polls changed around, and so they'll hold for a period of time. Once we do have that election, we'll be back here because I think we will see quite a lot of change in a very short sort of time. My predictions have never been right, though. So.
I would echo what Amanda says, really. I think it's, as we talked about, inheritance tax hasn't really changed significantly for best part of 2 decades. The one change they've had in that time was the residence nil rate band, which, as I understand it, doesn't really make the revenue very much money because it costs too much to administer. So my prediction would be that there has to be some changes. But as Amanda says, I think that the counterbalance to that is inheritance tax. It's a very, very unpopular tax. No one likes it. People perceive it very negatively. But it doesn't actually generate much revenue. And at the same time, you've got the Labour Party who are highlighting the fact that the tax burden of the public is the highest that it's ever been. So they don't want to follow that up by putting taxes up. So I think that there has to be some changes because the can has been kicked so firmly down the road for so long. And as Amanda says, that's the genius of Sunak and Hunt in terms of how they've recouped that revenue post-pandemic. But I think all that has done is delayed the inevitable, because you've now got, certainly my field of expertise is capital taxes, both of those are now getting more and more sort of obvious that some reform is needed. What that reform will be, I don't know, but the reality is we've had a government since post-Brexit that either hasn't wanted to or hasn't had the political capital to make any significant changes. If the polls are to be believed, then next year or the year after, we will have a government which will have a very significant majority, so will therefore have that political capital that they could use to make those changes. It's, at the moment, we're in that sort of skirmish or pre-skirmish stage where everyone's trying to create a point of difference between the two parties. We saw the government experiment with that before and then sort of back away. I think between now and whenever the budget will be, or whenever the election will be, we will start to see those point of differences starting to crystallise, and the shadow boxing will turn into a proper match. So,
Thank you.
Watch out.
Any other questions? Nothing online. Perfect. All right. Well, that just really leaves me to extend our thanks again to Tom and Amanda. It's been great to listen to you this morning. Thank you all very much for joining us.